Hello, and welcome back, dear listeners. Tonight, we step into the fog-draped streets of 1950s Chelsea, where art and ambition collide in the most dangerous of ways. A single black rose arrives at a door. No name, no signature, only a note, written in a hand too careful to be innocent. By morning, its recipient lies still in a sunlit studio, surrounded by canvases that will never be finished. Was it love that turned to obsession, or obsession that was never love at all? Only one man can peel back the petals of this mystery. The meticulous, the brilliant, the ever so particular Hercule Poirot. So settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let us begin.
The black rose arrives. The rain had stopped by the time the flower boy turned into Glebe Place, though the cobbles still held the wet shine of it, catching what little light spilled from the gas lamps. He was not, strictly speaking,
A boy, nearer 40, with the stooped shoulders of a man who had spent too many years carrying things that were not his own. He carried, on this particular Tuesday evening in October, a single long box tied with black ribbon, and he did not know, nor much care, what was inside it. He knocked twice at the door of number 14, a narrow house that had been converted, as so many in Chelsea had, into studios for artists who could not afford anything grander. A woman answered, young, perhaps 26, with dark hair pinned back carelessly, and paint beneath her fingernails that no amount of scrubbing had quite removed. Miss Vivian Carrow, the flower boy asked, though he already knew the answer. He had delivered to this address twice before. That's me. She took the box with the faint, pleased surprise of someone unaccustomed to being sent things. She did not tip him. She had, in fact, very little money to spare, but she smiled in a way that made most people forgive her for it, and the flower boy touched his cap and went back out into the damp evening without complaint. Vivienne carried the box up the narrow stairs to her studio on the first floor, humming something from the wireless that had been playing earlier. She could not now recall the tune, only that it had been cheerful, and she had liked it. The studio was cluttered in the particular way that belonged only to painters. Canvases stacked 3 and 4 deep against the walls, jars of turpentine gone cloudy with use, a north-facing window that let in grey October light even now, in the evening, when there was precious little light left to let in. She set the box on the table beside her easel and untied the ribbon. Inside, resting on a bed of tissue paper, was a single rose, black, or as near to black as any rose could truly be, a deep and velvety crimson, so dark it swallowed the lamplight rather than reflecting it. Beside it lay a small card, unsigned, the handwriting slanted and precise in a way that suggested someone who had practiced the words before committing them to paper. You wore red the night we met. I have thought of little else since. Vivienne read it twice. She was not, by nature, a nervous woman. She had modelled for half the painters in Chelsea, and had grown a thick skin against the sort of attention that came with being looked at for a living. But something in the particularity of the note unsettled her, though she could not have said exactly what. It was not the boldness of it. She had received bolder notes from bolder men. It was perhaps the certainty of it. The writer did not ask. He remembered. She set the card down and looked at the rose for a long moment, turning the box slightly so the flower caught the lamp differently. Who's it from, then? The voice came from the doorway, and Vivienne turned to find her friend Marjorie Finch leaning against the frame, a cigarette unlit between her fingers, having let herself in as she always did. The downstairs door was never properly locked, a fact Vivienne's father had complained about on his one visit to London, and which Vivienne had promptly ignored. No idea, Vivienne said, and found, oddly, that she did not want to say more. Marjorie crossed the room and picked up the card without asking, reading it with the particular nosiness of an old friend. Well, that's rather thrilling, isn't it? Red the night we met. Doesn't ring any bells. I wore red at the Hartigan exhibition in June, and at Peter's party in August, and really rather often, if we're honest. It's my best colour. So it could be anyone. It could be anyone. Vivienne agreed, though she said it more slowly than the words required, as though testing whether she believed it. Marjorie lit her cigarette at last and wandered to the window, peering out at the street below, half in jest. Is he lurking out there now, do you think? Some tragic figure in a mackintosh, waiting to catch a glimpse of you? Don't, said Vivienne, and there was enough genuine discomfort in the single word that Marjorie turned from the window, surprised. I was only teasing. I know, I'm sorry. Vivienne laughed, a little too brightly, and set the rose in a glass of water on the windowsill, where it sat black against the darkening sky. It's only, I don't like not knowing things.
You know that about me. You like knowing everything about everyone and nothing about yourself given away in return. Yes, I do know that about you. Marjorie said it fondly, without malice.
And the two women fell to talking of other things. A sitting Vivienne had that Thursday for a portrait commission. A dreadful play Marjorie had been dragged to the week before. Whether the little Italian restaurant on the King's Road was worth the extra shillings. It was gone 9 when Marjorie finally left, promising to call round on Friday, and Vivienne was left alone in the studio, with the lamp burning low and the rose sitting black in its glass of water on the sill. She did not throw the note away, though she told herself several times that she ought to. She put it instead in the drawer of her writing desk, beneath a stack of old letters from her mother, and told herself she would think no more of it. She was mistaken in this, as she was mistaken in a great many things that autumn, though it must be said, in fairness to her, that she could not possibly have known it. Outside, the street was quiet, the rain beginning again in a fine mist that blurred the gas lamps into soft, indistinct halos. If anyone stood watching the lit window of the first-floor studio from the shadows across the road, no one saw them do it. By morning, no one would think to ask. A body in Chelsea's studio. Marjorie Finch arrived at number 14 Glebe Place a little after 10 the next morning, later than she had intended, having overslept after a restless night. She let herself in through the downstairs door, as was her habit, and climbed the narrow staircase, calling out Vivienne's name in the cheerful, unthinking way of someone who expects an answer. None came. She thought little of it at first. Vivienne was often absorbed in her work of a morning, deaf to the world when a canvas was going well, and Marjorie had learned long ago not to take the silence personally. She knocked once on the studio door, more from politeness than expectation, and pushed it open. The north light was pouring in, grey and even, exactly as it did every morning, falling across the easel, the jars of turpentine, the half-finished portrait of a woman in a green dress that Vivienne had been fussing over for a fortnight. It fell, too, across Vivienne herself, who lay on the floor beside the window seat, quite still, one arm flung out as though she had reached for something in her final moment and found it just beyond her grasp. Marjorie did not scream. She would remark on this later, to the police and to herself, with a kind of bewildered shame, that she had not screamed, had not even properly understood what she was looking at, for what felt like a very long time, but was in fact only a few seconds. She simply stood in the doorway with her hand still on the frame, and said, in a voice that did not sound like her own, "Vivienne." It was the rose that told her, before her mind had properly caught up with her eyes. It lay on the floor beside Vivienne's outstretched hand, not the black rose from the glass on the windowsill, which still stood there, drooping now but otherwise undisturbed, but a second rose, identical to the first, its petals a few having scattered loose across the floorboards, as though it had been dropped, or thrown, or pressed into a hand that could no longer hold it. Marjorie did not remember walking to the telephone. She remembered only standing in the hallway downstairs, with the receiver pressed hard against her ear, giving the address to the operator,
in a voice that kept climbing higher and higher, until the woman on the other end told her, quite kindly, to sit down and wait. Someone was coming. Detective Inspector James Japp of Scotland Yard was a solid,
square-built man, with a face that had long ago settled into an expression of permanent, weary suspicion, the sort of face that had seen a great many things in 30 years of police work, and had stopped being surprised by most of them. He arrived at Glebe Place shortly before noon, having been pulled off another matter entirely, and stood now in the doorway of the studio with his hat still on, surveying the scene with the particular stillness of a man cataloguing details he would need to remember later. "Strangled," said the police surgeon, crouched beside the body, without looking up. "Some hours ago. I'd say between 10 and midnight last night, though I'll know better once I've had a proper look. No sign of a struggle to speak of. Whoever did it, she likely knew them, or trusted them enough to let them close. And the flower. Not my department, Inspector, but it's fresh. Cut yesterday, I should think, or the day before at the outside." Japp grunted and moved further into the room, careful of where he placed his feet, his eyes moving over the canvases stacked against the walls, the cluttered table, the open drawer of the writing desk where a note lay half visible beneath a stack of letters. The same note, though Japp did not yet know this, that Vivian Carrow had received the evening before, tucked away and half forgotten. He picked it up with a handkerchief, read it twice, and his frown deepened. "You wore red the night we met. I have thought of little else since. Sergeant," he said, "get me the name of every man this girl's been seen with in the last 6 months. Painters, patrons, sweethearts, the lot. And find out who delivered flowers to this address yesterday evening. Somebody in this street will have seen the boy come and go." The sergeant, a thin young man named Beddoes, nodded and began making notes with the particular earnestness of someone new enough to the job to still find it interesting rather than merely grim. Japp stood a moment longer in the center of the room, looking down at the second rose lying loose upon the floorboards, its petals scattered like something that had been broken rather than merely dropped. He did not, as a rule, believe in feelings about a case. Evidence was evidence, and feelings had no place in an investigation, whatever the newer men liked to say about instinct. But he found himself standing there in the cold grey light of that Chelsea studio, with a feeling nonetheless that this was not a crime committed in anger, nor in the heat of a single terrible moment, but a thing planned with care and executed with a kind of dreadful patience. He had seen killers who lost their heads. He had rarely seen one who sent flowers first. "This one's going to want a second pair of eyes," he muttered, mostly to himself, and Beddoes glanced up, uncertain whether he was meant to have heard it. Japp did not explain. He was already thinking, though he would not have admitted it easily, of a small, egg-headed Belgian with an extraordinary moustache and an even more extraordinary opinion of his own intelligence, an opinion which had, in Japp's long experience, an irritating habit of proving itself correct. Inspector Japp calls on Poirot Hercule. Poirot was, at that precise moment, engaged in a matter of considerable delicacy, the correct positioning of a single ornamental clock upon his mantelpiece, which had been disturbed by no more than half an inch by his manservant George's dusting, and which Poirot had now spent the better part of 10 minutes restoring to its proper place. "There," he said, stepping back to admire the result with evident satisfaction. "Now it is as it should be. George, you understand, it is not merely that the clock must be straight. Any fool can achieve straightness with a spirit level. It must be straight in relation to the vase, and the vase in relation to the window, so that the eye, when it passes over the room, finds nothing to trouble it. Order, George, symmetry. These are not luxuries. They are the very foundation of a well-ordered mind." "Very good, sir," said George, who had heard some version of this speech perhaps 400 times in his years of service, and had long ago stopped attempting to formulate an original response to it. The doorbell rang before Poirot could expand further upon his philosophy of interior arrangement, and George went to answer it, returning a moment later to announce that Chief Inspector Japp was below and wished to see him. "Japp!" Poirot's small dark eyes brightened at once. "But send him up, George, send him up. It has been, 3 months since he has troubled me. I had begun to think Scotland Yard had finally solved all of London's crimes without my assistance, and no longer had need of me." "I doubt that very much, sir," said George, with the faintest suggestion of dryness, and went to fetch the inspector. Japp came in still wearing his coat, which he did not remove even when Poirot gestured him toward a chair, a fact which Poirot noted with the particular attentiveness he brought to all small details of human behavior. A man who kept his coat on in a warm room was a man who did not intend to stay comfortably, or who was too preoccupied to notice his own comfort at all. "You've a look about you, my friend," Poirot observed, settling himself opposite. "The look of a man with something unpleasant on his mind, and no very good idea what to do about it." "Got a body in Chelsea," Japp said, without preamble, dropping into the chair. "Young woman, artist's model by trade. Vivian Carrow, 26 years old, strangled sometime last night in her own studio. No sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle worth mentioning. Whoever did it, she let them in herself, or they had a key, or she simply wasn't afraid of them until it was too late to be afraid of anything." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly, and he folded his hands together, resting them upon the considerable curve of his waistcoat. "This is sad, certainly. But Chelsea sees its share of sad endings, mon ami. And you have not, I think, come all this way merely to share your sorrows with me over the coffee I have not yet offered you. There is something more. There's a rose." Japp reached into his coat and produced the note, still folded in the handkerchief he had used to lift it, and passed it across. "One delivered to her yesterday evening, with this note tucked inside. Nothing signed, nothing to go on there. And a second rose, same kind, black as your hat, found on the floor beside the body this morning. Petals scattered about like it had been crushed in her hand, or near it." Poirot took the note delicately by its edges and read it, his lips moving very slightly as he did so, as was his habit when a piece of evidence struck him as significant. "You wore red the night we met. I have thought of little else since." "Ah," he said softly, and set the note down upon the small table beside him with a care that suggested he had already begun, in the private workings of his mind, to build something from it. "This is not the note of a man in the grip of a sudden passion, Japp. Regardez, the hand is careful, practiced. A man who writes such a note in the heat of feeling does not trouble himself so much with the shape of his letters. This is a man who composed his sentence beforehand, who perhaps wrote it more than once before he was satisfied." "That's more or less what I thought myself," Japp admitted, "though I couldn't have put it so fancy. And the second rose, it was not, I think, delivered that morning? It was already in the room? That's the strange part. My sergeant's been round the flower shops this morning. Only one that sells that particular variety anywhere near Chelsea. Imported thing, black as a raven, costs more than most working girls see in a week. And they'd only one order for it this month. Delivered to Glebe Place, yesterday evening, 6 o'clock. Poirot went very still. "One order, Japp, one rose. That's right." "Then where?" said Poirot, very quietly, leaning forward now with the particular intensity that came over him when the shape of a problem first began to reveal itself, like a face emerging from shadow. "Did the second rose come from?" Japp opened his mouth to answer, and then closed it again, and Poirot had the distinct satisfaction, though he was too well-mannered, on this occasion, to show it openly, of watching the same thought occur to his old friend that had already occurred to him. "Unless," Japp said slowly, "somebody brought it with them, already knowing they'd need one there, at the scene, when they were done. Précisément. A gift given twice, once to charm, and once, I think, to sign the work, as an artist signs his canvas." Poirot rose from his chair with sudden decision, reaching for his hat and cane, his earlier good humor replaced entirely now by the sharp, focused energy that Japp had seen in him 100 times before and had learned, over many years of grudging partnership, never to underestimate. "This is not a man who loved and lost his head, mon ami. This is a man who has been planning something for a long while, and who wished, for reasons we do not yet understand, for the world to know it when it was done. Come, we will go to Glebe Place, and I shall look upon this poor girl's studio with my own eyes, and then, Japp, then we shall see what manner of gardener has been cutting roses in Chelsea. The studio and its secrets. The studio at number 14 Glebe Place looked, by the time Poirot arrived that afternoon, exactly as such rooms always looked after the police had finished with them, swept clean of the worst of their horror, but retaining, somehow, an atmosphere that no amount of tidying could quite dispel. The body had been removed. The chalk outline remained, a small indignity that Poirot regarded with distaste as he stepped carefully around it. "You will forgive me, Japp," he said, removing his gloves finger by finger with great deliberation. "If I do not rush. A room such as this one, it does not give up its secrets to a man in a hurry. It is like a woman who has been wronged. She will speak, but only when she is ready, and only to one who is willing to listen properly." Japp, who had heard variations of this sentiment before, and had long since stopped finding it either profound or irritating, merely gestured for Poirot to take his time, and settled himself by the door with the air of a man prepared to wait. Poirot began, as he always began, not with the obvious, not with the chalk outline, nor the drawer where the note had been found, nor even the second rose, which had already been removed for examination, but with the room as a whole, standing quite still in its center and turning slowly, allowing his eyes to move across every surface with the patient thoroughness of a man reading a difficult text in a foreign language. "She was a painter of some talent," he observed, moving at last toward the stacked canvases against the far wall and drawing several of them out into the light. "See here, Japp, this is not the work of an amateur who dabbles for want of better occupation. There is discipline in the brushwork, and yet—" He paused over one canvas in particular, a half-finished portrait of a stern-faced older man in a dark suit. "This one, I think, was not painted for pleasure. Observe the hands. She has struggled with them, painted them over more than once. A commission, perhaps, and not one she enjoyed. Portrait of some patron, probably," Japp said. "Girls like her did that sort of work to make ends meet. Sitting for painters, sure, but also taking commissions of their own when they could get them. Just so. And commissions require patrons, and patrons require introductions, and introductions require friends." Poirot set the canvas aside and moved to the writing desk, where he stood for a long moment before opening the drawer himself, though he had already been told what it contained. He drew out the stack of letters beneath which the note had been hidden and examined them with care. Mostly correspondence from a mother in Yorkshire, warm and unremarkable, full of small domestic news that made Poirot's expression soften briefly before he set them aside. It was in the second drawer, beneath a folded scarf, that he found the sketchbook. "Ah," he said, and there was a particular note in his voice that made Japp straighten from his position by the door. "Found something? Perhaps. Perhaps nothing at all. A young woman's private drawings, which is her right, and which I feel some hesitation in disturbing." He turned the pages nonetheless, slowly, his brow furrowing with concentration. Most of the sketches were studies, hands, faces, drapery, the ordinary practice work of an artist keeping her eye sharp. But toward the back of the book, the character of the drawings changed. Here were quick, almost furtive studies of a man's face, drawn from several angles, as though the artist had been trying to capture something about him she could not quite name. The face was never fully rendered. Always the eyes were left unfinished, or the mouth blurred, as though the pencil had trembled. "You know him?" Japp asked, crossing to look over Poirot's shoulder. "I do not know him, but I think, Japp, that Mademoiselle Caro knew him very well indeed, and that something about him troubled her enough that she found herself drawing him again and again, as though the act of drawing might help her to understand what it was that troubled her." Poirot closed the sketchbook carefully and held it as though it were something fragile. This is often the way with artists, I think. They see with the hand what the mind is not yet ready to admit. He continued his examination of the room for the better part of an hour, and Japp, to his credit, for he was not by temperament a patient man, did not once press him to hurry, having learned long ago that Poirot's slow circling of a scene, however maddening it appeared, generally yielded more than a dozen hasty searches by lesser men. It was as they were preparing to leave that Poirot paused by the window seat where the body had lain, and crouched, with some difficulty and a small grunt of complaint about his knees, which Japp pretended not to notice, to examine the floorboards more closely. "There is a mark here," he said slowly. "A scuff, quite fresh, on the boards beneath the window." "And the window itself, Japp, was it found open or closed this morning?" "Closed." Sergeant Beddoes noted it particular, since it was a cold night and there'd been no fire lit. "Closed," Poirot repeated, and for a moment something in his manner suggested a man arranging pieces that did not yet quite fit together, though he could sense the shape they were meant to make. "And yet the scuff mark suggests to me that this window was opened, and recently. The paint along the frame is disturbed in a manner consistent with someone forcing a stiff sash upward, not merely someone leaning against it." He straightened, brushing off his trousers with visible distaste for the dust he had gathered. "It is a small thing, mon ami. Perhaps it means nothing at all. But I do not like small things that do not yet explain themselves. They have a way, in my experience, of becoming very large things indeed." They left Glebe Place as the light was beginning to fail, Poirot carrying the sketchbook under his arm, with the sketchbook's owner's mother's letters, left carefully, respectfully, exactly as he had found them. "Where to now?" Japp asked, as they stood on the pavement in the thickening grey of the evening. "Now, mon ami, we speak to the friend who found her, Mademoiselle Finch, I believe you said her name was. A woman who visits so freely, who lets herself in without knocking, who calls another woman's name up the stairs as though it were her own home. Such a woman knows things about her friend's life that even mothers in Yorkshire do not know." Poirot settled his hat more firmly against the evening chill. "And after that, Japp, I think we must discover the names of every man who might have wished to see Vivienne Caro wearing red, and thought of little else since." The suspects gather. Marjorie Finch received them in her own small flat off the King's Road, 2 streets from Glebe Place, looking pale and reduced in a way that suggested the previous night's sleep, if she had managed any at all, had not been kind to her. She had changed out of the clothes she had worn that morning. Japp noted this with the automatic attention of long habit, and Poirot noted, with attention of a different kind, that she had done so not from any wish to appear composed, but because she had been, quite simply, unable to bear the sight of them any longer. "I keep thinking," she said, once they were seated and she had refused, twice, the offer of tea,
"that if I'd come at my usual time, I'm always there by 9, only I overslept. Perhaps I might have—" She stopped, unable to finish the thought, and Poirot leaned forward with the particular gentleness he reserved for the genuinely
grieving, as opposed to the merely frightened, between whom he had long ago learned to distinguish. "Mademoiselle, I must tell you something that experience has taught me, and which I hope will bring you some small comfort, though I know it cannot bring very much. Your friend died, the doctor believes, some hours before you would have arrived." "There was nothing you could have done, except perhaps to have died alongside her, which I do not think she would have wished for you." He allowed this to settle before continuing, his tone shifting, almost imperceptibly, into something more businesslike. "I wonder, instead, if you would help her in a different way now. Tell me of the men in her life, not the harmless ones. Every young woman has those, and they need not detain us. Tell me of the ones who mattered enough to trouble her." Marjorie was quiet for a long moment, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. "There was Gerald Ashworth," she said finally. "He'd been mad for her since the spring, proposed to her twice, and she turned him down both times, though gently, because she was fond of him, just not in that way. He took it badly the second time, wrote her letters for weeks after. And more recently, Sylvia Marchmont. She and Vivienne modelled for the same painters, competed for the same commissions. There was no love lost there, though I don't know that it went further than sharp words at parties. Sylvia lost a portrait commission to Vivienne back in September, a good one, paid well, and she wasn't gracious about it. And this?" Poirot produced the half-finished portrait he had asked Japp to have brought along, the stern-faced older man whose hands Vivienne had struggled to render. Marjorie's expression tightened. "Mr. Aldous Reeve. He commissioned that from her not 2 months ago."
A wealthy man, older, a collector of some standing in Chelsea circles. He took a great interest in her work, and in her, if I'm honest, though nothing improper that I ever saw. But he called round often,
more often than a patron strictly needs to. Poirot filed each name away with the care of a man cataloguing specimens, and thanked Mademoiselle Finch with a warmth that seemed to steady her somewhat, before he and Japp took their leave. Gerald Ashworth received them in the sitting room of his mother's house in Kensington, a thin, anxious young man of perhaps 30 who could not seem to keep his hands still, and who wept, briefly and without embarrassment, when told plainly of Vivienne's death, though Japp had, in fact, delivered the news rather less plainly than Poirot would have preferred. "I loved her," Gerald said, when he had composed himself. "I won't pretend otherwise, not now.
But I hadn't seen her in a month, perhaps more. She made it very clear I wasn't to call any more, and I respected that, though it near killed me too." "You did not send her a rose then," Poirot said, watching him closely.
"A black one, some days past." Gerald blinked, genuine confusion crossing his features. "A rose? No. I never sent her flowers after she refused me the second time. Seemed a rather pathetic thing to do, chasing a woman with roses when she'd already told you no twice over." His hands twisted together in his lap. "I know how it looks. Rejected man. Bitter. All of that. But I wasn't bitter. I was only sad." Poirot said nothing for a moment, studying the young man's face with the particular stillness that Japp had learned to recognize as deep concentration rather than mere pause. "Where were you, Monsieur Ashworth, 2 nights ago, between the hours of 10 and midnight?" "Here, at home. My mother will tell you the same. We played cards until nearly 11, and I went to bed straight after." "Your mother?" Poirot repeated, and something in his tone suggested he did not consider a mother's word, however sincerely given, to be the most reliable of alibis. He made a note of it nonetheless, and they moved on. Sylvia Marchmont was a different matter entirely, a striking, self-possessed woman who received them in a flat considerably grander than Vivienne Carrow's studio had been, and who showed no particular grief at the news of her rival's death, though she was careful, Poirot noted, to arrange her features into an approximation of sorrow, a beat too late to be entirely convincing. "It's dreadful, of course," she said, seating herself with the unhurried grace of a woman accustomed to being looked at. "Though I won't pretend we were close. Vivienne and I moved in the same circles, that's all." "You lost a commission to her in September," Poirot said, without preamble, watching for the reaction. Sylvia's mouth tightened very slightly. "The Reeve portrait, you mean?" "Yes. I'd have done a better job of it, if I'm honest. But Aldous Reeve took a fancy to her. Not to her painting particularly, and there's not much a girl can do about that, except take it with good grace, which I did." She met Poirot's eyes directly. "If you're wondering whether I strangled a woman over a portrait commission, Monsieur Poirot, I should think you'd find that rather beneath me. I've lost commissions before. I dare say I'll lose them again. And where were you, mademoiselle, 2 nights past?" "At a supper party in Fulham, until well past midnight. A dozen people can vouch for me, and I'll happily give you their names." She said this with the confidence of a woman who knew her alibi to be unassailable, and Poirot, though he made note of the names she provided, found himself inclined, on this occasion, to believe her. It was Aldous Reeve who unsettled Poirot most, though he could not, in that first interview, have said precisely why. Reeve received them in his own home, a handsome house in Cheyne Walk, overlooking the river, and spoke of Vivienne Carrow with a grief so carefully measured, so entirely appropriate in its expression, that Poirot found himself thinking, not for the first time in his long career, that genuine sorrow rarely arranged itself so tidily. "A remarkable talent," Reeve said, gesturing to the unfinished portrait, which had been returned and now stood, incongruously, against the wall of his study. "I'd hoped to sponsor a small exhibition of her work next spring. She had a great deal more to give the world." "You called on her often, monsieur, for a man who was merely her patron." Reeve's expression did not change, though something in his eyes sharpened. "I take an interest in artists whose talent I admire, Monsieur Poirot. I don't believe that requires further explanation, nor do I believe it makes me the sort of man capable of what you're clearly implying." "I imply nothing, monsieur," Poirot said mildly. "I only ask, where were you 2 nights past, between the hours of 10 and midnight? Here, alone. I dined early and retired to my study to read. I've no witness to offer you beyond my housekeeper, who will confirm I was in the house by 9, though she cannot say what I did once she'd gone to her own bed." Reeves' tone carried the faint, cool irritation of a man unaccustomed to having his word questioned. "I loved that girl's talent, Inspector, and if I'm honest with you, I was rather fonder of her than a man my age has any business being of a woman so young. But fondness is not murder." They left Cheyne Walk as the last light was failing over the river, and Poirot walked some way in silence, his brow furrowed in the manner of a man turning something over that did not yet sit comfortably in his mind. "Well?" Japp said at last, unable to bear the quiet any longer. "Which of them do you like for it?" "I do not yet like any of them for it, mon ami, which troubles me a great deal more than if I did." Poirot stopped walking altogether, looking out over the darkening river with an expression Japp had seen before and had learned to respect. "Monsieur Reeve, I think, tells us less than he knows. Mademoiselle Marchmont tells us more than she needs to, which is sometimes its own kind of concealment. And young Ashworth," he shook his head slowly, "young Ashworth weeps very convincingly for a man who has had a month to prepare his tears." "So you think it's him?" "I think, Japp," said Poirot, resuming his walk with sudden briskness, "that I do not yet think anything at all, and that this is precisely the moment in an investigation when a lesser detective begins to make his gravest errors, by mistaking a strong suspicion for a certain fact." He said this lightly, almost as a joke against himself, and Japp, walking beside him in the gathering dark, did not think to wonder, at the time, whether his old friend had spoken more truly than he knew. A wrong turn. It was 3 days after the interviews at Cheyne Walk that Poirot made the mistake which he would, in later reflection, judge rather harshly of himself, though Japp, when he came to hear of it, was inclined to be more generous, on the grounds that even the finest instrument may occasionally be misled by evidence that has been arranged, with some cunning, to mislead it. The trouble began with a letter. It arrived at Poirot's flat by the second post, addressed in a hand that struck him at once as familiar, though it took him a moment of frowning concentration to place it. The same careful, practiced slant he had seen in the note left with the first black rose. His pulse, though he would have been embarrassed to admit to such a thing in a man of his years and experience, quickened noticeably as he slit the envelope open with his letter knife. Inside was a single sheet, unsigned, the message brief. "You look in the wrong garden, Monsieur Poirot. The rose that mattered was cut long before Chelsea. Ask Mr. Ashworth about a summer in Yorkshire, 3 years past." Poirot read this twice, and then a third time, his small eyes narrowing with the particular intensity of a man who believes, quite genuinely, that a puzzle has just yielded up its shape to him all at once. It is a dangerous moment in any investigation, this sudden clarity. More dangerous, in truth, than confusion, for confusion at least keeps a man humble, whereas clarity, arriving too easily, has a way of closing the mind precisely when it ought to remain most open. "Yorkshire," he murmured to himself, and rang at once for George to fetch his coat. He was at Gerald Ashworth's mother's house within the hour, and he came this time without Japp, a decision he would later regret. Not because Japp's presence would necessarily have changed the outcome, but because Japp possessed a particular gift, born of 30 years spent doubting the word of frightened men, for asking the second question when Poirot, in his eagerness, had stopped at the first. "Yorkshire," Poirot said to young Ashworth, without preamble, watching the young man's face with great attention. "3 summers past. Tell me of it." Gerald went pale, genuinely, unmistakably pale, in a manner that Poirot noted with satisfaction, believing it to be the pallor of a man caught out. "I don't see what that has to do with anything." "I think you do see, monsieur. I think you see very well indeed. It's got nothing to do with Vivienne, nothing at all. I'd rather not. Mademoiselle Caro is dead, monsieur, Poirot said, his voice hardening. You will forgive me if I do not have great patience for what you would rather. It took the better part of an hour, and no small measure of pressing on Poirot's part, before the truth of the Yorkshire summer emerged, and when it did, Poirot felt, for the first time in some years, the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of having built an elaborate structure upon ground that could not bear its weight. The matter concerned a young woman named Eleanor Voss, a cousin of a school friend, with whom Gerald had conducted a brief and unhappy romance 3 summers before, in a village outside York. The affair had ended badly. Eleanor had broken it off, Gerald had taken it hard, and there had been, in the aftermath, some ugly words exchanged, a broken engagement of sorts, though nothing formal had ever been announced, and a rift between the two families that persisted to this day. It was, in short, a sad and rather ordinary story of young love gone wrong, and it had, so far as Gerald could tell, and so far as Poirot's subsequent inquiries confirmed, absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with Vivienne Caro. I didn't want it dragged up, Gerald said miserably, once the whole unhappy tale had been extracted from him. Not because there's anything shameful in it, only because Eleanor's married now, quite happily I believe, and it seemed a cruelty to disturb it for no good reason. And because, he hesitated, because I suppose I was afraid it would make me look worse. A man who's been jilted once and rejected twice starts to look, to people who don't know him, rather like a man with a grudge against women generally. I didn't want to give you that idea, when it isn't true. Poirot sat in silence for a long moment after this confession, and it must be said, in fairness to him, that he recognized his own error almost as soon as it had fully revealed itself, which was, in its way, a mercy, though a cold one. I have wasted 3 days, mon ami, he said to Japp that evening, with the particular bluntness he reserved for admissions he found genuinely unpleasant to make. 3 days, chasing a shadow in Yorkshire, because a letter told me where to look, and I was fool enough to look exactly where I was told. Happens to the best of us, Japp said, not unkindly, though he could not entirely suppress a small note of satisfaction at hearing the great Hercule Poirot confess to an error. It happened rarely enough to be worth savouring. Whoever sent that letter knew you'd bite. Knew you'd rather chase a clever lead than sit still and look at what was already in front of you. That is precisely it, Japp, and it is precisely why I am angry with myself, and not merely disappointed. Poirot rose from his chair and began to pace, a habit he indulged only when genuinely troubled. I allowed myself to be led, mon ami. I, who pride myself on leading others. Someone wished me occupied with young Ashworth and his sad little history, and occupied I obligingly became, like a dog chasing a stick thrown by a hand I could not even see. He stopped pacing abruptly. This tells us something important, however, even in my failure. Whoever wrote that letter knows a great deal about Gerald Ashworth's private history, knows it well enough to use it as a weapon, and knows me well enough to guess that I would find such a lead irresistible. This is not the knowledge of a stranger, Japp. This is the knowledge of someone who has moved in Vivienne Caro's circle, and perhaps in Gerald Ashworth's also, closely enough and long enough to have gathered up old secrets like a magpie gathers bright objects, against the day they might prove useful. So we're back to Reeve and the Marchmont woman. We are back, Poirot agreed grimly, to looking properly at what was in front of us all along, instead of running gratefully toward whatever was placed conveniently in our path. It is a hard lesson, Japp, and not, I confess, one I enjoy learning twice in one career. But better to learn it now, with only my pride wounded, than to learn it later, when the cost might be a great deal higher. He paused by the window, looking out at the darkening street with an expression Japp had rarely seen on him before, something that might, in a lesser man, have been called humility. Someone in this case is cleverer than I gave them credit for being, mon ami. I think it is time I stopped admiring my own reflection long enough to see them properly. The second rose. The letter that had sent Poirot chasing shadows to Yorkshire proved, upon closer examination by a specialist Japp trusted at the yard, to have been typed upon a machine with a distinctive flaw in the lowercase e, a small imperfection, barely visible to the naked eye, but unmistakable once pointed out, as though the letter E had been struck by a hammer very slightly bent. "Now we've something to work with," Japp said, with grim satisfaction, turning the letter over in gloved hands. "Machine like that's not common. We start asking round the shops that sell them, the offices that own them. It will take time, Japp, and I think," Poirot said slowly, "that we may not have so very much of it left to us." His instinct, as it so often proved, was sound. 2 days later, a second death shook the quiet streets of Chelsea, though this time, mercifully, the intended victim survived, and it was this survival, more than anything else, which finally handed Poirot the thread he needed. Sylvia Marchmont had received, that same Tuesday evening, a black rose delivered to her own flat, accompanied by a note strikingly similar in tone and hand to the one Vivian Carrow had received a fortnight before. Unlike Vivian, however, Sylvia was neither a trusting nor an easily frightened woman, and rather than waiting alone in her studio for whatever the night might bring, she had, with considerable presence of mind, telephoned Scotland Yard directly, quoting Inspector Japp's name, which she had taken care to remember from their earlier interview. Japp had a constable posted outside her flat within the hour, and Poirot himself arrived not long after, installing himself in the sitting room with the particular stillness of a spider settling into a web it has not built but intends nonetheless to make excellent use of. "You believe someone means to kill me," Sylvia said, with a composure that Poirot privately admired. "The same way they killed Vivian. I believe, mademoiselle, that someone means for you to believe that, which is not quite the same thing, though it may prove just as dangerous to you if we do not take proper care." Poirot's eyes moved to the rose, sitting black and glossy in its glass on her mantelpiece, and something in his expression suggested a man doing careful arithmetic. "Tell me, who besides myself and Inspector Japp knew that you were interviewed in connection with this case? Half of Chelsea, I should think. It's not the sort of thing one keeps quiet, 2 policemen and a foreign detective calling at one's flat." She said this without particular bitterness, merely as observed fact. Aldous Reeve knew, certainly, I told him myself, rather flippantly, at a supper party. Gerald Ashworth, I've not spoken to directly, but these things travel. It was near midnight when the intruder came, and it was only the constable's vigilance and a length of good stout cord that Sylvia had, at Poirot's private suggestion, arranged to be conspicuously visible upon her own windowsill as though carelessly left there, that prevented the evening from ending in tragedy. The figure that attempted the window at the rear of the building, having judged the front too well watched, was seized by the waiting constable before a single word could be exchanged, and brought, struggling and cursing, into the lamplight of the small back garden. It was not, as Poirot had half expected and half feared, Gerald Ashworth. It was Aldous Reeve's manservant, a quiet, unremarkable man named Fenwick, who had served in the Reeve household for some 11 years, and who, once the initial shock of his capture had passed, said nothing whatsoever, though his silence itself told Poirot a very great deal. "He will not speak," Japp reported, some hours later, having spent a fruitless period attempting to extract a confession. "Not a word since we brought him in. Lawyer's been sent for. He will not speak," Poirot agreed, "because he has been instructed not to, and because he is, I think, a man of a certain old-fashioned loyalty that finds such instructions easier to obey than most men would find them." He sat very still, turning something over in his mind with visible concentration. "This is interesting, Japp, and troubling in equal measure. A manservant does not attempt to strangle a woman on his own initiative, out of some private grievance of his own. He had none, so far as we know, having met Mademoiselle Marchmont perhaps twice in passing. He attempted it because he was sent, by Reeve, or by someone with sufficient hold over Reeve's household to command such loyalty in his name. Poirot rose and moved to the window, looking out at the dark garden where the struggle had taken place not 2 hours before. "But here is what troubles me most, mon ami, and I confess, I do not yet see my way through it clearly. If Reeve wished Sylvia Marchmont dead, why send his own servant, whose connection to him could scarcely be concealed once discovered? A man clever enough to plan Vivian Carrow's death with such care, the 2 roses, the letter sending me to Yorkshire, such a man does not make so clumsy an error as sending a servant who can be traced to his own front door within the hour. Unless he panicked, wanted it done quick, before we got any further. Perhaps," Poirot said, though his tone carried real doubt. "Or perhaps, Japp, we are meant to think exactly that. Perhaps Fenwick was sent to be caught, a sacrifice offered up, so that our attention fixes upon Aldous Reeve, satisfied that we have found our man, while the true hand behind all of this continues to move, unwatched, in whatever shadow it has chosen for itself." He turned from the window, and there was something in his face now, not the earlier chagrin of a man confessing an error, but the sharper, colder focus of a man who has begun, at last, to sense the true shape of an adversary. "I was led once already in this case, Japp, and I paid for my carelessness with 3 wasted days. I do not intend to be led a second time. We will hold Monsieur Reeve for questioning, certainly, and we will press him hard. But I think, mon ami, that the answer we seek does not lie with him at all. I think it lies somewhere we have not yet thought properly to look, and I think we had better find it quickly, before whoever is doing this fine and terrible gardening decides to cut a 3rd rose. The truth in the petals." Poirot spent 2 days in near total seclusion, following the arrest of Fenwick, seeing no one but George, who brought him coffee, and meals he largely ignored, and who reported to Japp, when the inspector called round in some frustration on the 2nd evening, that Monsieur Poirot had done nothing but sit in his armchair reading and rereading a small collection of papers, occasionally muttering to himself in French, and had twice been found simply staring at the ornamental clock upon the mantelpiece, as though it had personally offended him. "He does this," George said, with the long-suffering tone of a man who had grown philosophical about his employer's habits. "Best to leave him to it, sir, if I may say so. He'll come to you when he's ready, and not a moment before." Poirot came to Japp on the morning of the 3rd day, and there was, in his manner, none of the earlier chagrin that had marked him since the Yorkshire misstep, only the calm, settled certainty of a man who has, at last, found the shape he had been groping toward in the dark. "I have been foolish twice in this case, Japp," he said, settling into the chair across from the inspector's cluttered desk at the yard. "And I do not intend to be foolish a 3rd time by speaking before I am entirely certain. But I am now entirely certain, and I think it is time we gathered everyone together. Monsieur Reeve, Monsieur Ashworth, Mademoiselle Marchmont, and Mademoiselle Finch also. And I think, Japp, that you had better bring Fenwick from his cell, for I believe he will find, once certain things are said aloud, that his loyalty has been rather badly misplaced, and that he owes it to himself to speak at last." They gathered that evening in the sitting room of Aldous Reeve's house on Cheyne Walk, at Reeve's own reluctant invitation, the curtains drawn against the dark river outside, and a fire burning low in the grate. Japp stood near the door with Sergeant Beddoes. A constable brought Fenwick in, pale and silent, and seated him apart from the others. Gerald Ashworth sat twisting his hat in his hands. Sylvia Marchmont sat very upright, watching Poirot with the wary attention of a woman who suspected, correctly, that she was about to learn something she would not enjoy. Marjorie Finch sat nearest the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed into an expression of patient, exhausted grief that had, by now, become almost a permanent fixture of her features. "I will not keep you in suspense longer than I must," Poirot began, standing before the fire so that he might watch each face as he spoke. "This has been, from its beginning, a case built upon a very particular kind of cleverness, the cleverness of a mind that understands not only how to plan a murder, but how to plan the investigation of that murder, laying false trails with the same careful hand that cuts a rose from its stem. I know this well, mes amis, because I myself walked down one of those false trails, and it cost me 3 days I shall not easily forgive myself for losing. The Yorkshire letter, Gerald said quietly. Just so, Monsieur Ashworth. A letter that knew your private history with a precision that could not have come from a stranger, that knew it well enough to use it as a weapon, confident that I, presented with so tidy and dramatic a secret, would run toward it eagerly rather than sit patiently with what was already before me. Poirot's eyes moved slowly around the room. Who among Vivienne Carrow's acquaintance knew of your Yorkshire summer, monsieur? Not Mademoiselle Marchmont, I think, who moved in rather different circles from yours. Not Monsieur Reeve, whom you barely knew. But a close friend of Vivienne's? A friend to whom you might, in an unguarded moment of old grief, have once confided such a story, trusting it would go no further than her sympathetic ear. Marjorie Finch had gone very still by the fire. And the second rose, Poirot continued, his voice gaining a certain relentless momentum now, which could not have come from the single order placed at the one shop in Chelsea that stocks such a flower. For that order, we know, was for a single bloom, delivered to Vivienne Carrow's own door. Someone, then, obtained a second rose independently, from a different source entirely,
and kept it ready against the night it would be needed. Needed not to charm, but to be left beside a body as a signature, a message, a claim of authorship over a death that had been very carefully, very patiently planned.
You're not suggesting, Sylvia began, but Poirot lifted a hand, gently, and she fell silent. I am suggesting, mademoiselle, that whoever killed Vivienne Carrow loved her, or believed themselves to love her, which is not always the same thing, with an intensity that had, over time, curdled into something possessive and afraid. A love that could not bear to be second in her affections. A love that watched, with growing dread, as Vivienne's world widened beyond it, as Monsieur Reeve took an interest in her talent, as her painting brought her new friends, new admirers, new futures that did not center so entirely upon the one person who had, for years, been the constant fixture of her days. A friend who let herself in without knocking, who called her name up the stairs as though the house were her own, who knew every private letter in that writing desk well enough to know exactly where a note might safely be hidden, and exactly where the police would later find it. Marjorie, Gerald said, in a voice of dawning horror, but Marjorie Finch did not move, did not speak, sat with her hands folded and her eyes fixed upon Poirot with an expression that had, at last, stopped pretending. You found the body, mademoiselle, Poirot said, more gently now, though no less relentlessly, because you had left it there yourself, some hours before, and returned the next morning, at your usual hour, to discover it exactly as you had arranged that it should be discovered, by you and by no one else, so that you might be the one to shape the story of what had happened, to guide grief and suspicion wherever you wished them to travel. It was you who wrote the Yorkshire letter, drawing my attention conveniently away. It was you, I think, who knew something of Fenwick's private difficulties, a debt perhaps, or some small dishonesty in his master's household that you had discovered and kept carefully in reserve, exactly as you kept your second rose in reserve, against the day you might need to use it. You sent him to Mademoiselle Marchmont's window, not to kill her, I think, but to be caught, a sacrifice offered up so that suspicion would fall at last upon Monsieur Reeve, and the true hand behind all of this might continue, unwatched, exactly where it had always stood, closest of all, weeping most convincingly of all, trusted absolutely by everyone in this room. Fenwick, in his chair by the door, had begun to weep, not from guilt at his own part in the attack upon Sylvia Marchmont, which had been considerable, but from the particular shame of a man who understood, at last, precisely how he had been used. She knew about the money, he said, in a low, broken voice, not looking at anyone. Money I'd taken from Mr. Reeve's account, small amounts, over some years, nothing he'd have missed, but enough to ruin me if it came out. She said if I did as she asked, just the once, she'd never speak of it. I didn't know. His voice cracked entirely. I didn't know what she meant to do to that poor girl. I swear before God I didn't know that. Marjorie Finch had still not spoken, and there was in her silence something that Poirot found more troubling than any confession might have been. A kind of terrible, exhausted stillness, as though the effort of maintaining her careful construction for so many weeks had, now that it had finally collapsed, left nothing behind it at all. "Why?" Sylvia asked, into the silence, her earlier composure entirely gone now. "Why, Vivian? You loved her." "I did love her." Marjorie's voice, when it came at last, was quiet, almost conversational, entirely without the drama Poirot had half expected. "More than anyone has ever loved her, or ever will. I gave her 10 years of my life, Sylvia. 10 years of being the one she came to, the one who knew her, while she went about falling half in love with every painter and patron who so much as looked at her twice, never once understanding that I was the only one who'd stayed." She looked, finally, at Poirot, and there was something almost like relief in her exhausted face. She was going to move, you know. Aldous had spoken to her about sponsoring her properly, a studio of her own, away from Chelsea, away from all of us, away from me. She told me herself, quite happily, as though she thought I'd be glad for her. Her hands, folded so carefully in her lap, tightened slightly. I couldn't let her simply leave, as though 10 years were nothing at all.
As though I were nothing at all. No one in the room spoke for a long moment after this, and it was Japp, finally, who moved forward, with the quiet, practiced gravity of a man who had done this many times before,
to place a hand upon Marjorie Finch's shoulder and speak the words that would end, formally, whatever remained to be ended. Poirot walked with Japp along the embankment some while later, the two men silent for a time, in the manner of old friends who did not always need words between them. "You'll be wanting your moment of triumph, I suppose," Japp said eventually, though without his usual gruffness. "Case solved, murderer caught, all that." "I am thinking, mon ami, not of triumph, but of 10 years. Poirot's voice was quieter than usual, and there was, in his face, none of the satisfaction that generally attended the close of a case. 10 years of a love that was never once permitted to speak its own true name, curdling slowly, in the dark, into something that could only express itself, in the end, through the taking of a life. It is a sad thing, Japp, and I confess I take little pleasure in having uncovered it, however necessary the uncovering was. He paused, looking out over the dark water. I made 2 errors in this case. I chased a shadow to Yorkshire when I ought to have sat still. And I looked, for far too long, at every love that announced itself loudly, Monsieur Ashworth's proposals, Monsieur Reeve's careful attentions, and paid too little attention to the love that never announced itself at all, because it had never once been given permission to. "You got there in the end," Japp said. "That's more than most manage." "I got there in the end," Poirot agreed, and allowed himself, at last, a small and tired smile. "Though I think, mon ami, that this is a case I shall remember less for its solving than for what it taught me, that the quietest devotion is very often the most dangerous, precisely because no one thinks to watch it, and that even I, who pride myself on seeing what others do not, very nearly failed to see what had been sitting, all along, in plain sight, holding a friend's hand and calling it love." They walked on together into the London night, and behind them, in a small Chelsea studio that would stand empty now for some while, a single black rose, the last of them, kept back by Poirot as evidence and never delivered, sat drying slowly in a drawer, its petals curling inward like something that had, at the very end, tried and failed to close itself against the world.